yesterday wrapped up a 3-day conference on the assassination records of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Robert Kennedy, and President John F. Kennedy. Next, a briefing on that issue that kicked off the conference hosted by the Coalition on Political Assassinations. This program lasts 40 minutes.
My name is Dan Alcorn. I'm on the board of the Coalition on Political Assassinations, an organization that we founded in 1994 to pursue public release of information about the American political assassinations. First, we were very interested in President John F. Kennedy's assassination, and then the assassination of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. and Senator Robert F. Kennedy, and other political assassinations. In the short time that our organization has been in existence, we've had quite an eventful period. The Congress passed unanimously in 1992 the JFK Assassination Records Act, and that act has been in implementation during this period of time. There's a federal organization called the Assassination Records Review Board, which has had a 2-year life and we believe will be extended by Congress for an additional year so they can continue until September of next year in order to process and release documents about the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Quite an enormous amount of material has come out through that process. We're talking 250,000 pages released from CIA files, which is the broadest CIA file release at any time in the history of that organization, and dwarfs other releases by that organization. And other federal agencies. The FBI has been turning over a quantity of information. The job is not complete because the quantity of information is so large. The Federal Assassination Records Board has decided that they need an additional year to finish their work. Congress held a hearing, I guess last week, a committee hearing on the topic. It looks like Congress is going to approve an additional year for the Assassination Records Review Board, and we think that that's quite appropriate. Also, during the period of time that our organization has existed, there's been a lot of public commentary on the topic of disclosure of government information. And so we have felt that the past 3.5 years that our organization has worked, 3.5 is right, a little over 3 years, that we've been in existence, that there's been a lot of progress on these issues that we're concerned about, but there's a long way to go as well. A recent disclosure that we think is particularly troubling and instructive is the disclosure of CIA documents from the 1954 Guatemalan coup d'etat operation, in which the CIA overthrew the democratically elected government of the government of Guatemala. Sometimes the stories don't pick up on the fact that it was a democratically elected government that we decided to overthrow in 1954. And 1,400 pages were released recently. It turns out that these 1,400 pages had been retained by the CIA only because they were the subject of a Freedom of Information lawsuit. They would have been destroyed if they had not been the subject of a FOIA lawsuit, as they ultimately announced many other records have been destroyed. But in this sort of accidentally preserved 1,400 pages, there's a statement, an admission of a CIA assassination program that was part of the Guatemala coup operation, and this program involved the targeting of 58 political leaders in Guatemala for assassination by assassin teams that were trained in conjunction with the CIA. There was discussion in those records of the shipping of silencers for .22 caliber rifles from the U.S. to the assassin team being trained in Honduras for use in the Guatemala overthrow of 1954. Now, the reason that this is so important is that the CIA did not inform the Congress of the United States of the existence of this assassination program when the Congress investigated the CIA's involvement in assassinations. So that in 1975, when the Congress made an investigation of this issue, they were not informed of this apparatus that we're now finding from 1953 and 1954. And we think that that describes the situation that we're in terms of achieving full disclosure, which we support, which is that we're nowhere near full disclosure, and we're still in the process of actually uncovering what it is that we need to go after for full disclosure. We're very disturbed that it has recently been announced in the New York Times that the CIA has destroyed their records on the Iran overthrow in 1953, despite the fact that 2 directors of Central Intelligence committed to public release of those records. Robert Gates, when he was director, committed in 1992 that the CIA would begin to release data on the Iran overthrow and the Guatemala overthrow from 1953 and 54. And then when James Woolsey became President Clinton's first CIA director, James Woolsey announced that he would follow through on that commitment and release these documents on those operations. It has now been released. It has been announced 5 years after the commitment that the reason they've never been released is that they were destroyed in the early 1960s, and that in fact there were no documents to release, and that the directors of Central Intelligence who made that commitment were misinformed or uninformed as to what actually existed in the CIA. This prompted Director Woolsey to make what I think is the appropriate statement, which is this is a travesty on the history of our country to have an official of the government go out and make a commitment like that to the American people, that public disclosure is going to be made and openness is going to occur, and then have the records not to exist and allegedly haven't existed since the early 1960s. And this is the kind of uphill fight that we have when we're trying to get full disclosure, that you really have to be very careful about representations that are made by these government agencies and organizations as to what's going to be released and what exists. And so we have a struggle. It is an important struggle because what is at stake is what Director of the CIA Woolsey said in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, which is this is the history of the country that's at stake. That when these records are destroyed, then we have lost part of the truthful history of what our country has done around the world and here at home over that period of time. And so we think that that makes it very important that we keep our work in pushing for public disclosure and for full investigation of the documentary record and try to get as much out as possible. There have been other things that have happened in this time. We had Dr. William Pepper, James Earl Ray's attorney, speak at our conference last year. Many of you attended that session and you heard William Pepper talk about the Martin Luther King assassination then. In the intervening time, obviously the media has picked up on the story and it's become quite a major story around the country. Dr. William Pepper will be back at our conference and will be speaking here tomorrow, I believe. And so Dr. William Pepper will update us on the Martin Luther King case. Finally, and something that I've had some involvement in, there's been a release of information about the FBI crime laboratory and indicating that there have been serious problems in the FBI crime laboratory over an extended period of time, which is something which is not unknown to assassination researchers. In fact, I had first heard of those problems through people who had researched on the assassination cases and told me that the crime lab work didn't look very good in relation to the assassination issues. It turns out that you don't have to take my word for it or the word of the assassination community, but why don't you look at the report of the Inspector General of the U.S. Department of Justice, who found systemic misconduct in the FBI crime laboratory. So we've had some things happen since we founded this organization that we think make the work of our organization and the existence of our organization very important, and very important to trying to get an accurate historical record of this period in our country, this modern period in our country, and that's what we have been working for and will continue to work for. Now I'm going to introduce our program chair for our conference. He's going to speak, then we'll take questions once we've made the presentations. We'll be happy to take questions from the press. I'm going to call at this point on Wayne Smith, Dr. Wayne Smith. He is the program chair for the conference this year. He's a visiting professor of Latin American Studies at Johns Hopkins University and directs an academic exchange program with the University of Havana. He is also a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy and formerly a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He served 25 years with the Department of State, assigned to the Soviet Union, Argentina, Brazil, and Cuba, was Executive Secretary of President Kennedy's Latin American Task Force, and cited as an outstanding Foreign Service officer by its chairman, Mr. Burrell. He was recognized as the Department of State's leading expert on Cuba. He has published extensively, has several books to his credit, including The Russians Aren't Coming, New Soviet Policy in Latin America. Let me call on our program chair, Dr. Wayne Smith. Wayne?
Thank you very much, Dan. Let me say that I do not wish to fly under any false flags. I am not one of the researchers looking into the facts of this case. I came to the assassination when I was Director of Cuban Affairs back in the end of the 70s, and I helped to arrange the trip of the House Select Committee to Havana, and I became interested in the assassination at that point, started reading about the assassination, and was appalled as I got into it to find that the Warren Commission clearly could not have been correct. And so I joined the Coalition on Political Assassinations because I'm very interested and wanted to be helpful, but I am not one of the researchers, and I have not written any books on the assassination itself. I think we have, hi, let's let Sarah McClendon get settled here. And hi, welcome. We have, I think, pulled together a very interesting program this year, and I would urge you all, including members of the press, to come back tomorrow for that 3 to 5 panel on the Martin Luther King assassination, when William Pepper will be here, in addition to others, to talk about that particular case. We're also going to have panels tomorrow morning on the history and overview of the JFK assassination. Some speakers will focus on Lee Harvey Oswald, some of the mysteries surrounding him, and on the forensic evidence. Panel 3, and to some extent Panel 5, will be on the forensic evidence, which I would say is the core of the case. The Coalition on Political Assassinations does not base its doubts or its rejection, outright rejection of the Warren Commission report on wild or even well-founded theories. Essentially, it is based on facts. I remember an interview that Dan Rather did some years ago when he was asked about the Kennedy assassination and his thoughts on it, and he said, well, before he had become Dan Rather, he had been a crime photographer in a small town newspaper, and so he always focused on the forensic evidence. And based on that, he saw no reason to believe that the Warren Commission had been wrong and that the assassination had not been carried out by a lone gunman firing from behind. Well, of course, that depends upon the forensic evidence that you're looking at. As we all know, the autopsy report that goes into the Warren Commission report is not the original autopsy report. The original autopsy report was destroyed by the autopsists. They themselves have acknowledged that, and they also destroyed all their notes. They also acknowledged that. Why did they do that? According to them, they didn't want that original report and the notes to become memorabilia. These are trained doctors. They're supposed to be trained autopsists. No trained doctor would ever destroy his notes and his original autopsy report on that basis. What goes into the Warren Commission report is an autopsy report that is written days later. We really don't know exactly when it was written, but certainly after Lee Harvey Oswald had been killed and pointed to as the lone assassin. Nothing coming out of the autopsy room that night substantiates or supports this second autopsy report. The artist's conception that you will see in the Warren Commission report shows a wound in the back of the neck. And the autopsists, of course, now say, or said at the time when they wrote the second autopsy report, that the president had been struck in the back of the neck. The bullet went through the neck, exited the throat, and struck Governor Conley. But the autopsy diagram they prepared that night shows the bullet not to have struck in the back of the neck, but to have struck down in the back, six inches down in the back. The death certificate places the bullet wound to the left of the third thoracic vertebra, or 6 inches down in the back. The report prepared by the two FBI agents who were in the autopsy room that night also places the bullet wound 6 inches down in the back. What difference does it make? Well, a bullet fired on a downward, from above, on a downward trajectory, striking in the back is certainly not going to exit the throat 7 inches above. I suppose there's some possibility that it can strike a rib and do a 90-degree turn and exit the throat. But if so, then it exits on an upward trajectory and certainly is not going to strike Conley. How have the autopsists explained this discrepancy in their autopsy diagram that night and the second autopsy report that they wrote days later? Well, they actually never have. They've never had to. And one of the reasons that we're waiting anxiously to see what the review board produces is because they at last have been deposed. And the autopsists, that is, have been deposed, and we're anxiously waiting to see what they said. It probably will not satisfy us. I'm sure they haven't said, well, actually we perjured ourselves. But it will be very interesting to see. In any event, the basis of our rejection of the Warren Commission report rests on many things, but most centrally on the forensic evidence, which does not bear out the Warren Commission report. So we're glad to see all of you here. We hope that you'll be back at all the panels, members of the press as well. Should I turn the floor over now, or do you wish to? Okay, Dan will. Sure, yeah, but we're going to have we're going to
hear them all, and then we'll
and then we'll ask questions. Okay?
We have one more first.
Go ahead.
Our next speaker is Dr. Phil Mellinson. He is the conference chair this year. He's a professor of political science at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. During the past 15 years, he's used Freedom of Information Act to obtain documents from the CIA, the FBI, the Secret Service, and military intelligence. These disclosures produced a series of exposés and profiles. He is the author of 9 books and 27 articles dealing with governmental secrecy, political violence, intelligence agencies, and public policy issues. Mellinson has published in such diverse outlets as The Nation, Library Journal, Transaction Society, Journal of Politics, World Features Newspaper Syndicate, and American Political Science Review. He has lectured widely and appeared or consulted in a number of television productions. His works include Spy Saga, a book on Oswald's intelligence connections, and the Robert F. Kennedy assassination, New Revelations on Conspiracy and Cover-Up, 1968 to 1991. His most recent work is Shadow Play, Robert F. Kennedy, Sirhan, and American Justice. Let me call on Dr. Phil Mellinson.
Thank you. I'm going to try to highlight for you some of the things we'll be doing on the RFK and MLK cases. And we really do have some exciting new information and some very important developments in each of those cases. We'll have with us tomorrow Dr. William Pepper, who, as many of you know, is James Earl Ray's lawyer, and the dramatic legal and ballistics evidence results that are going on in that will be talked to by Dr. Pepper. As many of you also know, some results of the rifle testing for the first time have come back. It's not clear to me what that means or what the legal strategies for reopening the case will be from here on, but we'll get to hear that firsthand from James Earl Ray's lawyer. And on Wednesday of next week, there will be a court hearing in Memphis that will solidify or finalize what's going on with the rifle testing. So it's a very important week in the MLK case. I'm going to highlight for you some of the developments in the Robert Kennedy assassination, the most dramatic of which is Sirhan's parole hearing coming up next Wednesday also. And that should be a very interesting event, and our hope is that it will focus not just on the legal issues, but provide some focus on the evidence issues in the case. I will also report on a writ of habeas corpus put together by Sirhan's lawyers, claiming very forcefully, I think, that he did not get a fair trial to begin with, and asking for another trial. There's also the Scott Enyart lawsuit that I reported on last year that many of you are familiar with, the young photographer who took pictures that he alleged showed the actual shooting of Robert Kennedy, and we don't have any such pictures. And a jury awarded him $600,000 in damages, implicitly concluding that LAPD had and destroyed those photos, and therefore Enyart was entitled to damages. And that is going to be appealed by LAPD, and I'll comment on that. Let me put in a plug for the importance of our main conference theme, which is full disclosure. One of the exciting things is you'll hear the reports of what we're getting in the JFK case, thanks to the legislation and the review board. I wish things were as rosy in the MLK and RFK cases. In the RFK case, Sirhan's lawyer, this far from 1968, has just put together the kind of legal brief that, had the files been released in 68 or 70, or had disclosure to the defense taken place at the appropriate legal and constitutional level, there would have been interesting appeals that might have changed the legal course of this case. As it is, since the files were secret until a decade ago, it's taken this long for the legal team to put this information together because the files were suppressed. In the King case, we're still waiting on those approximately 300, I think, John, in the King case, it's about 600,000 pages classified.
50,000.
600 to 750,000 pages of documents, still under congressional seal, as were the JFK records. And those records need to come out. They're important for the history of the case, for reinvestigation, and they're also central to James Earl Ray's legal plight for as long as he's alive, and also for the King family's continuing pursuit of the truth of the murder of their husband and father, which will take place whether Ray dies or not. And I think that's a very dramatic and interesting development. But absent those documents, which there's no apparent immediacy to disclose, it's going to be much tougher for anybody to learn the truth. And COPA is committed to the release of those files as it was to getting the RFK files and the JFK files released. So I hope you will stick around with us for these dramatic and interesting presentations. There's a lot going on, even given the time frame after all these years, and look forward to seeing you. Thanks.
I would also, before we take questions, I'd like to recognize John Judge, who's the Executive Secretary of COPA, and we very much appreciate all the work that John does, who really keeps this organization together so that we can come up here and do this. And so thank you. We'll take questions. Why don't we come up here, and just stand up here and go ahead and ask any questions and direct it to whoever you want.
I wanted to ask Mr. Milnes a question. You know that Sirhan parole hearing, I don't suppose that's a public hearing, is it, the parole hearing?
The parole hearing is semi-public in that it's a very small room, but my understanding is that Court TV will be allowed to have one camera there. The rest of the press pool will be segregated in a different room, and CBS is going, and there'll be some big cameras there, but a lot of them will have to feed off of Court TV, so it will be public.
The public won't be able to get in, though. Well, then.
I think it's very limited access. The part that's not public is the deliberations of the parole board, and I'd have to point out that two Sirhan paroles ago, the parole board said, let's go make our decision. They went into a room that they thought was appropriately locked, but the recorder was on, broadcasting to the press. They told 3 off-color jokes, joked with each other about whether they'd stayed in the room long enough, and came out and gave their verdict. So the deliberations won't be public, but the event should be.
Is it going to be in L.A.? Or
No, it's at Corcoran State Prison in Corcoran, California, about 100 miles north of L.A. That's in the prison where Sirhan resides.
That's really full disclosure, isn't it? To have that. Other questions? Yeah.
Mr. Alcorn, can you talk a little bit about what other information there may be out there as it relates to James Earl Ray, other than the bullet bullet in testing? Because it's obvious that they're going to need more than just a bullet to reopen this case.
Right, and I'm going to let Phil talk on that too, but I think it's almost important that you not focus so much on the bullet because there's a tremendous amount of other material and information in that case that needs to be looked at. The book that William Pepper wrote called Orders to Kill is really where you need to go to look because he's put together a tremendous amount of information, and the ballistics is only the one piece of it, but what he's put together is that we knew that there was U.S. Army surveillance on King until the day before the assassination because the Memphis Commercial Appeal newspaper reported that in an expose 3 or 4 years ago. But what William Pepper has done is take it beyond that. He has confirmed, got in touch with the surveillance team members through the reporter for the Memphis newspaper, and they say, well, yes, they were also there on the day of the assassination. More than that they were there on the day of the assassination, the U.S. Army Military Intelligence Team, he says, photographed the assassination at that time. They were taking photographs of King, surveillance photographs, and photographed the entire event. And I think it's much more crucial to understanding who did the shooting to try to find those photographs or any records of those photographs than to rely entirely just on the bullet, because the photographs are going to give you exactly what happened. There's a lot more information in Orders to Kill, but I can tell you that if such surveillance was there and took those photographs, the U.S. government should cough that up immediately. I mean, that is the most relevant information that you can ever imagine about that crime. And the fact that we know they were there the day before, and they had surveillance on King for a period of months. They were surveilling him everywhere he went. They bugged his hotel rooms. They put him in the hotel rooms where they wanted him to stay that had the bugs inserted. They made arrangements with the hotels, and they had wiretapping on the telephones, and they had photo surveillance. And I really think the best way to understand that event is to have them divulge all the surveillance they have. Phil, do you have?
By what authority do they not divulge that?
Well, there is no authority for them to do that, and in fact, if William Pepper says that the photographs show someone else shooting King, that they show a rifle extending from the bushes outside the back of the rooming house in the restaurant. If the surveillance photographs do in fact show that, then that is evidence that Ray is not guilty, and under the constitutional standard of Brady versus Maryland U.S. Supreme Court case, that should have been produced before his trial at any pendency between now, and it should be produced today under the law in the United States, because if the U.S. government has proof that someone's not guilty of a crime, the law in this country requires them to produce it pronto with no complaining. Now, if the information, it's conceivable that the information may have existed at one time and been destroyed, that's, a different situation, and we might try to reconstruct what it is, but I have a feeling that there's still some of that information in the files.
Yeah, I'd like to emphasize that Ray's lawyer, Mr. Pepper, did not go after the ballistics test because he thought it was the litmus test of guilt or innocence, the most important thing to do. He went after it because it was the only legal avenue available to him at that time under Tennessee statute, and he wasn't going to get a trial full-blown. The case against Ray would not be proved strong by the match of that bullet to the rifle. It is very, very weak, and I would guarantee that any reasonable jury looking for reasonable doubt, if they were presented with the absence of eyewitnesses, the absence of fingerprints where they should be, the presence of other suspects at the crime scene, and the very weak time and motion attributed to James Earl Ray by the government, that I don't think there's much doubt that they would find that there is reasonable doubt in his case. Secondly, the other part of this is who did it if James Earl Ray didn't. And we're not talking about non-existent witnesses or suspects. Bill Pepper presents a list in his book. I present an implicit list in my book. They overlap a little bit. They diverge a lot. The point is, if you want to bring people in under oath who might be suspects or are suspects and might have been involved or who might know who was involved, you can do that, and it could be a lengthy and very productive process. So we're not just talking about candelures and matches here. The bullet test is important, but it's only the tip of the iceberg in the truth of the King case.
Can I just follow up?
The Raul character that Mr. Ray continues to says was acting in cohorts with him, your speculation on who this Raul person might be?
Well, I'll leave that to William Pepper tomorrow because we have different theories on this, which shows that analysts can disagree. I think that there was not one Raoul, but a series of composites that Ray put together. Pepper, on the other hand, not only thinks there was one, but he thinks he's found the one, and it is this Raoul character that Pepper would present to the court if he got the opportunity in a trial, among others.
My understanding is that Tennessee law permits the private individuals to bring forward a prosecutor in a criminal case. That Tennessee is one of only a few states that permit private criminal prosecutions, and that what may happen ultimately in this case, if the state of Tennessee does not want to pursue this case, that a group of private citizens may pursue it under Tennessee law.
What's the reason for that, for them to destroy the original autopsy on Kennedy?
Well, I think the reason is because the original autopsy report would show that the bullet struck in the back and couldn't possibly have exited the throat. The FBI agents who were in the room that night wrote a report on this, and they described one of the autopsists as probing the back wound and finding it was only about a finger deep. It was a very light wound. And there not being a bullet, he not having discovered a bullet, he speculated, well, I wonder what happened to the bullet. During the autopsy, word came from Dallas that they had found a bullet on a stretcher. And the autopsist then said, well, that must be the bullet from the back wound. It worked itself out of the wound while they were working on him in Dallas. They did not examine the wound in the throat at all. They thought that was simply the result of a tracheotomy. They didn't even look at it. And yet, a couple of days later, you have the autopsist saying that it went in the back of the neck and exited the throat. The same bullet that that night they said must have worked itself out of the back wound. So if the original autopsy report had gone in, it would have indicated that the wound was in the back, as their autopsy diagram showed, could not possibly have exited the throat, and therefore could not possibly have caused the wounds to Governor Conley. And yet the wounds to Governor Conley were real, they were there, which means that there had to be another shooter firing from the rear to have caused those wounds. And if the wound in the throat is not a wound of exit, then it's most likely a wound of entry, which leaves you with a question as to what happened to the bullet. But given that they performed a tracheotomy and so forth, that is something that could perhaps be explained. But the original autopsy report is destroyed because you couldn't have had the single gunman firing from the rear theory put forward.
But following up on the Raoul question, isn't there some indication that the House Select Committee on Assassinations located or had knew about the whereabouts of Raoul and hid this information?
That's been suggested. Let me say that it's known that there's a lot of information on some of the people that we regard as suspects that is in House committee files. Sometimes they looked at people closer than they admitted in their final report. Sometimes they looked at them not hardly at all, but there's material there that didn't end up in their final report. So we really need that record to sort all that out.
Phil Melanson, I saw on CNN Headline News last night a story that they said the defense team for James Earl Ray is requesting additional tests on the bullet and the rifle, saying that they weren't happy with the results so far. Now, as far as I know, those results have not been made public. Would this be some kind of a leak or a preemptive strike to discredit if there is positive proof that the bullet does not match the rifle?
You can ask William Pepper tomorrow what his theory on that is, because the real legal word, the definitive word, will not come until Wednesday. How that story got out there, I don't know. But I did see it. I frankly don't quite understand it, even though I saw it, and I'm waiting for Pepper to explain it to me.
Press questions, yeah.
As it relates to the FBI and Martin Luther King, obviously J. Edgar Hoover had his reasons for wanting to discredit the King and his whole movement. Can you address this whole FBI issue and King and its wanting to get him, and could that have been part of this whole scenario that brought about this assassination?
I'll turn it over to Phil, but when we got the CIA documents that were released in 1993, as part of the JFK release, there was a package of documents in there that were related to the Martin Luther King assassination. They were on plain paper, CIA releases. They didn't have a letterhead, and they were reports of surveillance of Martin Luther King. And I told Phil about them, and he got hold of them. I think they're in that BBC documentary that will be played tonight. There's discussion of it. But reading these surveillance reports of King are a harrowing experience to read even now, because what was happening was that both the FBI and the CIA were focused on King in the spring of 1968 as being a threat to national security of the United States, because they were receiving informant reports from an informant that had been planted in his entourage, a fellow who turns out to be quite unreliable because he has a distinct political viewpoint, which he now admits he was embellishing the reports that were being provided to these government agencies to give basically his opinion, his personal opinion. And he said he never intended them to take his comments as fact. But you can tell from the reports that not only did they take them as fact, they circulated them between the FBI and the CIA. And I'll tell you what the guy was saying. What the guy was saying to them was that Martin Luther King is an agent of Peking, now known as Beijing, but then they spelled it Peking, and that his movement is being controlled by Peking, all right, Communist China. If you talk to that guy today, he says, well, that was my opinion, just watching what he did, that was what I thought was going on. I didn't mean them to take that literally, that was just my political perspective. Well, you can see from these surveillance reports and the internal memoranda, they took it very seriously, and they were very concerned in the spring of 1968 that Martin Luther King was going to lead a movement to Washington called the Poor People's March. It was going to be a follow-on to the march in '63. This was going to be the Poor People's March, and they were saying they were going to come to Washington in order to raise the issue of poverty in the United States. And it's clear that the security agencies saw that as a threat in the summer of 1968 to the functioning of the government in Washington, and saw it as an attempt to disrupt the functions of government. They went so far as they had informants in church groups, and they were getting informant reports from the church groups about how the King movement was asking for churches in the Washington area to help put up these people who were organizing this march, and the CIA was getting reports about how, and actually asked one of the church boards to have a dispute over whether to help the march. And I have to give credit to the Unitarian Church in Arlington. They voted 7-1 to help the march, and the CIA point of view was outvoted 7-1. But as you read those reports, you realize that in the spring of '68, from the government's security perspective, that they were in a very defensive and I would say paranoid state in the spring of 1968. And what's even more disturbing to me is that the same unreliable informant was telling them that Robert F. Kennedy was in the same position, and his reports are aimed at both Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy in that period of time. So.
Yeah, I'd just like to comment a bit here. I think we miss an important part of our history if we think that J. Edgar Hoover's personal pathology and racism, as it was directing the Bureau, was the real problem. It was a real problem. The real problem, the real story, is that the CIA, the FBI, and Army intelligence, according to their own documents, regarded the civil rights movement generally, and Martin Luther King very particularly, as the ultimate national security communist threat to the United States. And it's in writing, and we must add the Vietnam War to this equation, that in addition to economic justice, which they read as communism, now we have Dr. King stridently opposing the Vietnam War the year before his death, and the memos going back and forth and saying, now he's really Peking controlled. Look what he's saying now, that they've really got his buttons, and this is dangerous to our national security. So you had a panic situation in which independently but feeding off of each other, these three powerful intelligence agencies were zeroing in on Martin Luther King, and we know that two of them were there at the crime scene And if the CIA wasn't joining the trilogy, I would be very, very surprised. So they may hold the key to the truth of this matter more than any of the witnesses.
Do you think when King repudiated the Vietnam War, do you think that may have tipped the scale?
By the memos, it definitely tipped the scale. It went from a worrisome situation of racial animosity, hatred, and prejudice, and fear about economic politics and racial politics to a major national security issue, and that upped the ante tremendously.
Any other questions? Any follow-ups? All right, if not, thank you very much. We appreciate it. We have people here who have additional information about the conference if you would like it, so feel free to ask. Okay.
How you doing? I'm Charles Robinson with Black Charles. I wanted to know if I could sit both of you now just for a few moments because we're doing a whole big thing on who killed MLK, and it's in conjunction with a cover story that we have in Emerge magazine. You guys are going to try and set up a room. There's another room in the hallway, so if you can give us a few minutes. Yes, you got it. Let me ask a couple of things. First of all, do you have your books with you? My book is okay. It's not in that case. My Cambridge. Okay, so you need to get a shot of that. Yeah, there's a book. All right. One of the things we want to obviously talk about some of the things I just talked to you about, but also regarding obviously people the potential persons who've done it, because obviously you rule out race. Who do you have left? And I want to know about the documents. You mentioned in this document that some of the disclosures. Is that something else, or is it that book? Is it okay. Yeah, because we want to. I'll be here tomorrow. You have yours.
Yes, you might.
Okay. That's good. Is that the guy who worked for Jesse Harris? And was it a Jay Kennedy. No, I don't know. Jay Richard Kennedy. Right here. Because there were two people. I know there was another. There was a guy who was an informant who worked for Jesse Helms at one for Black Nine. And I know he had made some very controversial statements.
The Coalition on Political Assassinations continues to advise the JFK Assassination Records Review Board and Congress about the government's progress on releasing the President Kennedy assassination documents.